Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Once again, we would like to welcome all of you to the studio of the Swiss Re Center for Global Dialogue in Rüschlikon. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone watching us online right now. Last but not least, a special welcome goes to our speaker, Keir Giles, who will be discussing the topic, Who will defend Europe, in a panel discussion with political scientist and philosopher Katja Gentinetta. Dear Keir, dear Katja, a very warm welcome. Thank you to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, who will defend Europe is nothing less than a question of destiny. Now that Vladimir Putin's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine has caused considerable damage to the global security architecture. In addition, under the presidency of Donald J. Trump, our American brother is no longer clearly willing to stand up globally for security and order, especially in the European classes. The motto, American First, is causing great concern, as it seems to encourage the Russian despot, in particular, to relentlessly pursue his expansionist policy. Against this backdrop, it is quintessential that Europe reorganizes and rebuilds its defense capabilities, which it has, as we all know, criminally neglected for decades. However, it is also true that there has been little political will in this area to date that would lead to concrete action. What next? Which next steps can be considered realistic, and which threat scenarios need to be outlined for the coming years? Will the hybrid war already being waged between Russia and the free world escalate into a full-scale conflict? These questions can no longer be dismissed and are highly worrying signs for our times. Keir Giles is an expert on Russia and has written numerous important books on the subject, including one entitled Russians' War on Everybody and What It Means for You. Keir has spent his entire career observing, analysing, and explaining Russia. He is a senior consulting fellow at the British Royal Institute of International Affairs. After the discussion here on the podium, ladies and gentlemen, you will, as always, have the opportunity to ask questions, including also online. Advantage of this opportunity. Dear friends, the floor is entirely yours now.
Thank you very much, dear Martin, for this introduction. Good evening, Keir, also from my side. You told me that this is literally the first time that you are speaking in front of a Swiss audience. So, precisely my first question is, why should we in Switzerland worry about Russia? We are this small, neutral, wealthy country trying to come along with everybody, offering our good services. So, is there any danger for us?
Well, it's unusual for me to be able to give anybody any good news, but there's a bit of good news here. People in my job are constantly engaged in conversations about where Russia's next target is going to be. Where, after Russia frees itself up from its engagement in Ukraine, it's going to next look to redraw the borders of Europe. And nobody ever says Switzerland. So we may not be first in line here, but then that's where the good news stops, because we also have to consider what happens if you're last in line. Because if there is the expansion of Russia's war on Europe that Martin referred to, if Russia does decide to take on a member of the EU or NATO, by default, the entirety of Europe is involved, which means that even if you are an island of neutrality, you are surrounded by the disruption and chaos that Russia will attempt to bring. Because if you listen to Russia's military thought leaders about how modern warfare is waged, and how they've demonstrated this in Ukraine, they say that modern warfare is waged to the entire depth of the enemy territory in every domain possible. And Russia has practiced delivering damage and disruption at immensely long ranges. Some of that we see already playing out now in terms of the proxies that are being recruited to cause sabotage, the cyber attacks. But there's also the long-range missiles, striking at the ranges of thousands of kilometers, against which almost all of Europe has no defenses. So, it's all very well to stay aside from what Russia wants to do, but nobody should think that that will provide insulation from the effects, and that's just in Europe. There's also the broader global process, the proliferation of conflicts around the world, the disruption to the rules-based international order, the loss of restraint for unpleasant regimes around the world who have decided that the time is now to settle scores with their neighbors or with their own populations, because even before the arrival of Donald Trump in the United States had stepped back from that role of trying to constrain these processes globally. Despots around the world have looked at the way Russia has been able to attack Ukraine without the consequences that any non-nuclear power would have suffered, and the way in which the United States has stepped back from deploying its full weight to prevent this genocidal assault, and they have decided that the United States was already in retreat. We see the results in the enormous number of increases of people who are being killed and injured as a result of conflicts sparking around the world, and just the simple number of those conflicts. So we may not be in a world war, but we have plenty of world wars to deal with, and that trend is only going to increase and continue. So that's why we shouldn't pretend that anybody across the continent is going to be immune from the effects of these processes, both within Europe and globally as well.
Thank you. I mean, even if we might not be directly targeted, we have to be concerned of what is happening. I think this is what you say. We will come back to Switzerland at the end of our conversation, but now, first I of course want to know a bit more about Ukraine, about your assessment of the current situation in Ukraine. I mean, we know that the front line is more or less the same for months now. Russia is stuck. Ukraine is fighting back as much as possible. Is it anyhow moving over there? What do you see? What do you take care of when you look at it?
It does seem to be a static situation. Russia continues to fight because it thinks it is going to get more from fighting on than from accepting the ceasefire that has been offered by the United States, and which it's tried to extort Ukraine into accepting. That may or may not be an accurate assessment of the situation, but Russia certainly seems to be guided by it. So they continue to grind forward on that front line at immense cost in their own casualties, and they continue to commit nightly murder of children across Ukraine with the missile and drone strikes. And meanwhile, Ukraine too fights on because they have no other choice, because it is a war of national survival, so they will continue. And meanwhile, both of the coalitions that are backing both sides in this conflict seem to have decided that neither of them is going to intervene strategically and decisively on the side of the country that they are backing, whether it's Russia or Ukraine. So we have all the ingredients at the moment for this to continue more or less indefinitely. Ukraine getting stronger by replacing the support that previously it would have had from the United States, and while Europe is still not in a position to replace that, through its own domestic defense industry efforts. And Russia digging deep into the manpower sump to throw more people into the front line as bullet sponges while trashing its economy. But both of them with significant reserves so they can continue doing this for some time to come. We shouldn't rule out another strategic surprise from Ukraine. We also shouldn't rule out that Russia may feel the pressure sooner than expected, now that Ukraine has been allowed to carry out its campaign against the Russian economy that was previously blocked by the United States. But neither of those is going to bring immediate ends to the conflict. That will take a much more serious re-evaluation within the Kremlin of the balance of risk and success, and whether they can actually achieve what they think is a tolerable outcome without catastrophic damage to their own economy.
I mean, interestingly, the Ukraine aid is shrinking. Nevertheless, Trump imposed new sanctions to Russia regarding oil. Is that going to have any significant impact? What do you think?
Well, let's see what happens by November the 21st, because as ever, there is wriggle room within the sanctions as they're currently presented for Trump to back out. We shouldn't underestimate the drama of this new development, because this is the first time that Trump has done something that will be uncomfortable for Moscow. And that, of course, will be concentrating minds in the Kremlin. As ever, we see a rescue mission sent from Moscow to try to change his mind immediately. Plainly, they are concerned about this. But there is still plenty of room for Trump to revert to the default pattern of behavior and make sure that there is nothing happening which Russia would find distinctly uncomfortable. So let's look for how that might express itself in the other means by which Trump can appear to be doing something without necessarily having that serious impact on the Russian economy. For instance, the tariffs on India that we saw previously, punishing India for buying Russian oil and therefore making sure that India was closer to that coalition of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea as a result. It is still the case that there is only one person in the world that can stop this war overnight, despite Donald Trump's claims, and that is Vladimir Putin. But he's not showing any signs of being interested in doing so for the time being.
Now, looking from outside, looking from Switzerland, we're not really touched. We know that Russia has gone into a war economy. We know that it's building up. Nevertheless, we see that it's stuck. So, how do you estimate the Russian army? Is there something going on? Do we really have to fear about something beyond Ukraine from Russia?
There's always something going on. The problem that we have when we have these conversations in Western Europe, west of Warsaw, is that a lot of people have looked at what's happened in Ukraine and assumed that the Russian armed forces can't actually do anything else. They see that Ukraine has fought the Russian land forces to a standstill and think that means that they are not a threat. But they overlook a couple of critical elements to that. First, the fact that where Russia has been stopped, it is by the largest army in Europe, with a mobilized economy and a mobilized population fighting a war of national survival, which is a very different situation from if Russia were to make a move against a NATO or an EU nation. Secondly, it is only the land forces that have been affected. The army was eviscerated in the early months of the conflict, but then was very rapidly rebuilt. So rapidly that by the beginning of 2024, it was already 15% larger than the army that went in. A different, qualitatively, army, but still one which could do catastrophic damage to any neighbor. Since then, it has continued to expand. The predictions that Russia would run out of manpower have not turned out to be correct, and now Russia is building up once again a strategic reserve, so that even if the manpower currently committed to Ukraine were to remain committed there, Russia still has options for doing things on land elsewhere. But it's not just on land. Those means of delivering damage at immensely long ranges that I talked about are primarily not from the land forces. It's the Navy. It's the Air Force that are launching the missiles. It's the cyber forces. It's the nuclear forces, which of course have not come into play in this conflict except being used as an information weapon. All of those remain relatively intact, with the exception of the Navy and the Black Sea, which is a self-contained theater. So all of them are still available for attacking Europe. So it's a misleading picture if we just look at that land front line within Ukraine.
So there's no reason to underestimate what is going on in Russia. And how do you assess these airspace violations that are coming along now practically every day? Is that something new? Is this another test? Is this a pre-war? How do you assess that?
All of the above, except it's being something new. This is something that has gone on for a considerable time, but it gets more attention when it reaches a certain scale. And when it is something which is most obviously connected to the conflict in Ukraine and could potentially be a spillover of that conflict. With that, I have in mind the mass drone incursion into Polish airspace, up to 20 drones, which were in the context of a raid going into Ukraine, but a tiny, tiny fraction of the drones that were directed against Ukraine. The ongoing campaign of drone incursions and disruption across Europe is nothing new. This is something that we have seen sporadically for the last decade. But again, it gets attention when it affects a sufficient number of people. When you close down European airports that somehow, inexplicably, a decade after this started, still don't have defenses against this, means of investigating, mitigating, and preventing drone disruption, then, of course, you affect a lot of people and it makes the headlines and people think it's a new problem. Is it a test? Absolutely, because Russia learns from all of these incidents, not only what the impact is going to be, but also the response, the capacity of the victim country to mitigate it, to prevent it, to investigate it, prosecute it, and also whether they are willing to impose costs on Russia in return. All of this is useful information, and it also applies to the campaigns of cyber attacks and sabotage against logistics hubs, against warehouses, against individuals. Every single time Russia does this, it gathers useful intelligence both on how effective it is and how much Russia is actually going to suffer as a result. If the answer to that is yes, there is a return on investment that is worthwhile, then we can be sure that this will be activated at a much larger scale when Russia does decide to make a move against Europe.
So, I mean, you would have no doubt that Russia is in war with Europe.
Well, Russia has no doubt that Russia is at war with Europe.
Yes, even Russia has no doubt about that.
About, I think, January of 2024, I was sitting in a location not unlike this, where there was a retreat by high-level officials from the EU and NATO trying to get together and talk about the problem. And one of the most depressing things that I heard a senior figure from the EU say, a household name, but it was under the Chatham House rules, so I should not repeat it, was Russia is at war with us. We can say that in this room, but we cannot repeat it outside. That is
why?
Part of the
Yes.
problem. Yes.
Why?
That is part of the problem.
The facts that you have about Russian military is the one thing, and the psychology is the other thing. I mean, what you now said about this airspace of cyber attacks, sabotage, etc., etc., etc. Of course, we know it's to make us feel uncomfortable, to make us feel threatened, but those who know who should know better, why are they not clear enough in the public on that? What is your reason? What is the reason that you see for that? Is it a lack of courage? Is it a lack of capacity? Is it fear? What is it?
Or all of the above, plus the fact that if you admit there's a problem, politically you're forced to do something about it.
Yeah.
And that is where it gets very complicated. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not universal across Europe, and this is one of the areas where we see this very pronounced gradient of understanding from northwest to southeast across the continent. If you are in a frontline state and you feel the effects of Russia's sub-threshold warfare on a daily basis, and you see the costs on your economy, and you have people in your country with living memory of what it means to be dominated by Russia, there is no doubt that this has to be prevented and must never happen again. If you're further away, then you have political leaders who not only have not avowed the threat, but also have it in their interests not to mention that there is a problem. As we see from attempts by, for example, Spain to shut down mention of war within the EU because it triggers difficult political decisions. But the net result is we've had across Western Europe a criminal dereliction of responsibility by leadership figures not explaining what is happening and not explaining what the potential result could be. Because there are too many people across the continent who have been allowed to believe that the rights and the freedoms and the liberties and the prosperity that they enjoy come for free and can be taken for granted and do not need to be defended because nobody's explained that they are under threat and nobody has explained what is going to happen if no steps are taken to mitigate that threat. That is a huge part of the problem of Europe as a whole being prepared to defend itself, because if you are a democracy, it's impossible to defend yourself against a threat about which the majority of your voters is simply unaware.
You are playing Putin in a war game, a podcast called War Game. It's a typical scenario where how governments should test about their defense. And there is a British team and there is a Russian team. Of course, the British team is played by all former professionals who know their role very well. And you are in the red team, you're in the threatening team, you're playing Putin. How is it to play Putin? How does it feel?
Well, as Martin said, I've spent my entire professional career trying to understand and explain how Russia operates. So to some extent, it comes naturally. And I hope I did a reasonable job. At least those people that regularly watch Putin on television were checking that I had included some of the trademark Putin gestures, jokes, smirks, smug little remarks. All of the things that we did for this War Game podcast for Sky News were intended.
You find it on Spotify if you're interested. It's really interesting to listen to.
It is called very simply The War Game, and it was an effort by these former defence professionals in the UK, former defence minister, Home Office minister, senior generals, etc., to do precisely that, a raising of awareness among the population and also among political classes about what was at stake. Now, briefly, the scenario was Russia seeking to coerce the United Kingdom and doing so by means of long-range missile strikes. I shan't spoil any more of it if you do decide to listen to the podcast later. But one of the things, and this comes back to the root of your question, what it's like playing Putin in that scenario, one of the things that came through very clearly was how ill-equipped the British team were to deal with what Russia prioritizes and how Russia defines success and failure. Russia doing things that were not just unexpected for the blue team, for the British side, but inconceivable. Russia setting up so many distractions that they did not know which way to look. Well, are we actually doing something in Estonia or in Gibraltar, for example? And most of all, highlighting how little the United Kingdom could actually do if placed in that scenario. Because of 30 years of running down its armed forces, because of a lack of integrated air and missile defense system that would be adequate for the threat, and most of all, because of the elimination of any civil defense or civil protection system that would prepare the population for when they were actually under attack. All of these things put the British team in front of impossible decisions at the cost of very, very little effort from the Russia side. And the problem is, that's not just the UK. That's any country in Western Europe that has similarly neglected its conventional defenses, its air defense, and its civil defense as well.
And the interesting thing is that what comes along there, and what is very clear for some years now, let's say like from February 22, is that our estimation on cost-benefit calculations, economically, socially, etc., they just don't fit for Russia. I mean, Russia is just not making the same calculation we do. And this is something that you're pointing out in different texts and panels, that we still, or too many of us, still assume that Russia is some sort of a normal country, which is now some sort out of tune, but will come along as soon as this war is over, and then we can try again to come along with a normal nation, with a normal economy. And you just say this will never be the case.
One of the previous books that was mentioned, Russia's War on Everybody, I dedicated it to Vladimir Putin because he had made my life very much easier when trying to explain that Russia is a different country from Europe, simply by waging genocidal wars of colonial reconquest and conducting mass atrocities during them. This shows far clearer than any explanation by me what we're dealing with, a threat from outside our continent and also from outside our century. But that problem of assessing when Russia thinks it is winning and when it's losing, what the cost-benefit analysis is, what risks they will take, what damage they will suffer in pursuit of an objective, is something that, yes, we still grapple with today. And it comes through, for example, in this assessment of whether Russia is currently winning the war. we may think that the disastrous state of the Russian economy and the enormous death toll would be too high a price to pay for the historic vision that Putin is trying to realize. But that is not the calculus in the Kremlin, which is measuring success and failure by completely different metrics. And that has real implications for how and whether anybody might be able to induce Russia to stop fighting, because none of the incentives that would apply to a Western liberal democracy are actually going to hold sway in the Kremlin.
And interestingly enough, you don't even make a real difference between the Kremlin and the regime and the Russian people. I mean, we as, let's say, normal Democrats, we would immediately say, no, you don't have to put in one basket the people and the regime. But you do it. You don't really make a big difference between Russian people and the regime.
There are Russians who disapprove of the war. Mm-hmm. Mostly they have self-selected themselves out of the conversation through various different processes, through waves of emigration, for example. A first wave in February 2022 when people did not approve of what Russia was doing and wanted to be somewhere else. A second wave in September of 2022 with Russia's partial mobilization. They might not necessarily have disapproved of the war, but they didn't want to be involved in it personally, so they left too. Meanwhile, also from mid-2021 onwards, you have had, as part of the preparations for this confrontation with the West, a clampdown on domestic dissent within Russia as well, and a move from controlling opposition to eliminating it altogether. So if you are anti-war and have remained in Russia, you know to keep quiet because the consequences of not doing so are so severe. But another really important point here, and this is one which is problematic for people engaging with Russian organizations and individuals who describe themselves as being in opposition outside Russia, is the number of people who may be in opposition to Vladimir Putin but are not at all in opposition to his goal of reinstating the Russian Empire. Those are two very different things which sometimes get confused in lumping together everybody that is not in favor of the current regime in Moscow. But it's absolutely vital for understanding that key question of who in Russia thinks that the Russian army is doing bad things in Ukraine or is actually fulfilling its historic mission of re-establishing Russia as it should be. Mm.
So there is no sense of hope that this is going to change by rationality or so. Let's stay with the psychology one more. We talked already about leaders who don't dare to talk about the danger there is from Russia. And is this precisely what Putin wants to hear? I mean, would he react differently if European leaders would stand up and say, we know that you're threatening us, we know that we have to invest in deterrence and defense, and you're not going to make one more step to the European border, whatever. Would that change something?
Absolutely, but it won't happen. Mm-hmm. And this is the problem we have across the whole of the continent, where things like that have been said. Yes, we know that Russia is a threat. Yes, we know that we must invest in defense. But now we're at the point where that crucial difference between saying you're going to do something and actually doing it becomes important. And if you have set timelines for yourself of a decade or so to improve your defenses to a certain state, to improve your defense spending to a certain random percentage of GDP, as opposed to focusing on the output, what you actually need to buy to be ready for conflict, over the course of, say, to 2035. And meanwhile, your intelligence services are producing estimates that Russia will be ready to move against a neighbor state, not in a decade, but in 1 or 2 years. There's an obvious problem there. Mm-hmm. But it is one which, again, European leaders are not addressing.
It's difficult enough. What about the nuclear threat? I mean, it is a fact that Russia has a nuclear threat. But it is also a psychological instrument. Which one of the two is more important?
The psychological instrument, by far. Russia has used nuclear weapons immensely effectively, but just as information tools rather than actually detonating them. And they have had spectacular success as a result. All of the times when Washington or Berlin said they would not support Ukraine because of the risk of whatever they variously called it, Holocaust, Armageddon, World War III, were validation for Russia that their campaign of nuclear intimidation that had been going on for far longer than most people realized, dating back a decade, was hugely successful because it conditioned the decision makers there and the people who were advising them into believing that you cannot confront Russia because it is too dangerous, because Russia is on a nuclear hair trigger. And the logical extension of that, and this is what has been so tragic for Ukraine, is that therefore you cannot allow Russia to be defeated because that is more dangerous than allowing a neighbor of Russia to be destroyed. And that leads on to those other neighbors of Russia that are members of organizations like NATO or the EU, looking at that decision process in Washington particularly and saying, how is it any different for us? Mm-hmm. If we too are attacked, that same calculus would apply. Therefore, what faith can we have in American security guarantees, again, even before the arrival of Trump? Because the United States had self-deterred itself from enforcing its security interests in Europe, even before the change of administration in January 2025.
Would you then go so far and say that the governments in Russia, in the Baltics, etc., they were not as afraid of this nuclear threat than Germany, France, Spain, and the US?
Absolutely. Those people that have paid closest attention to how Russia uses this information weapon and also how it thinks about when and why you use nuclear weapons were the least concerned about it. And the paradox there is that the people who had most to lose from being wrong, the frontline states, Ukraine, the Baltic states, etc., were the most confident that they were right. And again, this is something which we've studied in enormous detail, looking into precisely how this works over years, coming to the conclusion that there were no circumstances under which Russia using a nuclear weapon would make its situation better, rather than catastrophically worse.
Can you give us a rationale of that? Because, I mean, it's very easy for Russia to say, look, we have the bomb and we can just push the button. So what is the rationale behind it that you say that that's primarily a psychological and not a factual threat?
Let's look back at how the groundwork was laid for those very crude threats, look, we have a nuclear weapon, to actually be so effective despite the fact that they were so unsophisticated and relatively meaningless. Going back over almost a decade, you had a concerted campaign by Russia across every possible domain to lay the groundwork for that information input. And this was a pattern of messaging from all of the different levels of the information warfare machine from Russia, from Putin at the top down to the lowliest foot soldier in the Kremlin troll army at the bottom, through spokespeople, through propagandists, through the useful idiots and agents of influence abroad, centering on some key terms. They said that there would be miscalculation between Russia and a NATO state. This would lead to escalation, which would be uncontrollable, and this would inevitably lead to nuclear use, which would mean the Third World War. That was, through all the twists and turns of Russian propaganda over that period, a consistent message which was rammed home intensely at every single opportunity. Meanwhile, in the physical domain, Russia was also reinforcing this by giving the impression that these miscalculations were going to happen any time. If we think back to the campaign of brinkmanship, of unprofessional airmanship and seamanship around Russia's periphery that we saw up to 2022, it was part of this campaign, creating the impression in the minds of Western decision makers that there could be an inadvertent clash, and this would lead to the chain of events that Russia was describing. After 6 to 8 years of this, we saw the impact that it was having. We saw the exact same words and phrases that these Russian mouthpieces were using starting to be repeated by people who really ought to have known better, like Western heads of state and even heads of individual armed forces. That was the point at which, when Russia made these crude threats, these nonsensical diagrams on Russian television of missiles that didn't exist, coming from places where they would never be based, and obliterating London, Paris, and Berlin, had much more impact, precisely because they fell upon this fertile ground that had been prepared so long before. Mm-hmm. It's a classic example of Russia exercising reflexive control. Not just disinformation, not just propaganda, but establishing an entire decision-making framework by feeding in all of the data that informs the decision, and then just the final information input that leads the adversary to deter themselves.
Okay, so if we don't have to fear a nuclear attack, what you're saying basically, what do we have to fear then, concretely?
It depends who we is. But again, coming back to this conversation about who is likely to be Russia's next victim in this campaign to re-establish the empire, to redraw the borders of Eastern Europe, which is precisely what Putin has said he wants to do in his explanations to the Russian people of why they invade Ukraine, and also started doing of Russia's own maps of Ukraine itself. That leads most people to think that the primary target and the first target has to be a frontline state. And we hear again and again the scenarios that are very familiar for how Russia might move against, for example, a Baltic state, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, potentially Poland, maybe Finland. But the problem with that idea is that Russia is seeking to challenge not those individual countries, but the system that supports them and keeps them independent. The rules-based international order, the international organizations of which they are members, the EU, NATO.
And the NATO, especially.
Exactly. So, if Russia wants to cause NATO to evaporate, it doesn't necessarily need to strike at one of its weakest member states. If it can coerce a core member of NATO, one of the supposed military heavyweights, not to act when called upon to do so, then that is likely to be a much better return on investment. So what should we be afraid of? Russia seeking to achieve its broader geopolitical aims through targeting a country that most people might not think of as an obvious target for Russian aggression.
Such as?
Such as the example that we've talked about already in the podcast, The War Game. The political aim is through coercing the United Kingdom into submission and at the same time ensuring that its supposed allies do not come to its assistance. That is the kind of scenario that Russia will be working through. How can we cause the entire raison d'etre of, for example, NATO to collapse in order that it does not pose a threat to us by protecting its individual member states, and therefore those individual member states can be tackled one by one because they no longer have that international support. So where is the weakest link, and where is the best political return on investment for the risk and the resources that we'd be taking on by attacking it?
That means that, as you said, Poland, Baltics, who are heavily investing in deterrence and defense, will probably not be the targets. But that means that everybody else has to come along with deterrence and defense, because they are already doing their job. They have their backup, at least the Baltics from the US. So I mean, there might not be the big threat. The big threat are all the other countries which are not really prepared.
We shouldn't necessarily say that anywhere is probably not going to be a target, because it is a constantly shifting equation. Not just because countries' defensive potential changes over time, not just because Russia may have different assets to use at any different time, but also because of that political interplay. There will be different returns on investment at different times from different strategies, and that is constantly evolving. But it's true that some countries have made themselves hard targets and therefore less likely to be the target that will be chosen by Russia. In the book, Who Will Defend Europe, I give the example that you just mentioned of Poland, which has poured billions into trying to make its armed forces relevant for warfare as it's fought by Russia now, and therefore become a less tempting target. Also Finland and its comprehensive defense or total defense system, a system of civil defense that was not dismantled after the end of the Cold War, and therefore provides a strong basis now for making sure that the economy can function, society can function, people can continue to live their lives at a time when Russia is doing its very best to stop all of those things happening, as we see in Ukraine. That too makes Finland a hard target. So Russia is likely to look elsewhere. The analogy that always comes up when you're thinking about how to deter Russia from attacking you by looking at other softer targets elsewhere is it's like outrunning a bear. You don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than your slowest friend.
And there we are in the question of defense in Europe. I mean, Europe is really scaling up for years now. It's struggling, it's putting up programs for industry, for innovation, for ammunition. It's putting billions of euros into the system. Is there any chance to keep up with the threat?
We don't have to overmatch the threat. We just need to make sure that the return on investment is not going to be what Russia expects or hopes for in order to make the threat a reality. And that is as much a function of the political will that we talked about as of rebuilding deterrence, rebuilding the armed forces. The problem is neither of those are visibly adequate at the moment. There's no doubt that if the processes of making defense forces relevant for warfare as Russia understands it today do not keep up with Russia rebuilding its own forces, then that is an open invitation to Russia to try its strength against a European state. But, as you say, things are happening slowly. They're moving in the right direction. It takes more than political declarations and making funds available, though, to actually make this happen. And the biggest challenge is the number of countries across Europe that still think that they are on a peacetime footing and that they are not already having war waged against them, and therefore that they have time, which they don't.
Which Ukraine is buying for us.
Which Ukraine is buying for us at immense cost in the lives of its people and in the future of its economy and society.
I mean, you say that Europe should be ready for full deterrence for 2030 or even earlier. I mean, this is just tomorrow.
I keep hearing this 2030, and I have no idea where it comes from.
Okay.
A lot of
I read it somewhere.
Yeah, I've read it somewhere. In fact, I've read it in a lot of different places. Every time I ask the people who write that Russia is going to be ready to do something by 2030, where they got this idea from, the answer is exceptionally vague.
So could it be Russia who is giving in that number?
It's not impossible, but also, after a certain number of years in this business, you detect how many things become accepted as established fact across media coverage, despite actually not having any basis in real assessment.
So is this to give us some hope?
If so, it's not particularly helpful. What is very clear is that the pattern with the assessments of when Russia might be ready that are, in fact, authoritative and evidence-based, is that the lead time that is available has been getting shorter and shorter. At the beginning of 2024, NATO officially said that it would take 10 to 20 years for Russia to reconstitute its armed forces to a state where NATO should be concerned about an attack on a member state. By the middle of that year, that was down to 3 to 5 years, coming from various different European leaders. By the end of that year, the Danish Defense Intelligence Service gave a range of predictions, the shortest of which was 6 months' time, by which Russia might be ready to do something that would challenge a member state. So if you look at that and compare it to this idea that Russia might be ready by 2030, Europe might be ready by 2035, again, there's an obvious problem.
So the problem remains. And I mean, one problem is, of course, also European Union, where not every state has the same assessment of the problem and of the threat. And that's why these new formats come along, like the Coalition of the Willing, like SAFE, like others. Are they a good means? Are they an important tool? Or is it just one more try, which is not really helpful?
Are they good? Are they important? Well, they seem to be the only option at the moment, because the very fact that you have to put together a coalition of the willing says that there are countries in Europe that are unwilling to defend themselves and defend the continent against the threat. That in itself is a major problem for the continent. But also there's the fact that all of this talk about the coalition of the willing is very hypothetical, not only in the fact that it only comes into play after peace is achieved by some means in Ukraine, and therefore it's not particularly relevant to the challenge we have at the moment. But also because of this understatement of the difference between a coalition of the willing and a coalition of the able. And it's the able that would actually make a difference in terms of deterring Russia. There's a problem that's come through in this attempt to establish a coalition of the willing since the beginning of this year, with repeated cycles of it getting more attention in the media and therefore stimulating some kind of activity that looks as though it might be getting ready to do something, which is that there already was a coalition of the willing ready and in place to carry out the kind of mission that's envisaged. It was called the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF. It was a coalition of 10 countries across the top of Europe, all of whom had a similar view of Russia and the threat that it posed, and all of them with agreement on the fact that you need not necessarily wait for NATO or for the EU in order to do something about it. Now that was an organization which on the face of it seemed to satisfy all of the requirements that are currently being set for a new coalition of the willing. It had a structure into which you could plug national contingents being contributed to a joint force. It had a deployable headquarters, and yet nobody mentioned it. It disappeared from view altogether in terms of discussing how you might put together a coalition. What seems to have been the case is that the realization dawned that because of this drawdown of military potential across so many European countries for so long, it simply wasn't capable of carrying out a mission or a political task that involved being somewhere where Russia didn't want it to be. And that is the reality that faces so many European armed forces that have relied for so long on American support, that when that support is not available, suddenly they find they are not, in fact, capable of fulfilling their core purpose.
Mm-hmm. After having looked to Europe and saying what they can't, what they cannot do, where they're not capable, let's have a look to Switzerland, the so-called hole in the donut. I mean, this expression comes from the former American ambassador to Switzerland, but as I read only recently, it's also already a citation of General Cavoli, of NATO General Cavoli, who said that Switzerland is this hole in the donut. What is your assessment of Switzerland? Did you ever have a look on Switzerland?
No, it's the hole in the donut.
For you as well. I mean, we spoke about defense, we spoke about timelines, we spoke about GDP. Just to give you some context, our understanding of the timeline is still that the government is still, not the defense ministry, I must say, not the defense ministry, but the government is still discussing whether we should raise defense budget to 1% of GDP per 2030 or per 2032. This is our sense of the timeline. What did you tell the Swiss government?
There are two sides to the problem of Switzerland not being generally in this conversation. The first is the good news that I started with, the fact that Switzerland is not the most obvious target except for secondary and tertiary effects of what Russia might want to do. The flip side of that is that by the same token, it's more or less irrelevant to European defense conversations, which may not be a very comfortable place to be if the rest of Europe is in fact finding that it is embroiled in a conflict, and therefore everything, because the problem with being a hole in a donut is you're surrounded by donut, is in a state of war, and what that means for an isolated area that depends on communications with the rest of the outside world. Plus, of course, everything that passes through Switzerland would be a target under those circumstances, because there is no reason whatsoever to suspect that Russia would be the slightest bit interested in notional neutrality if it sees a target that can be usefully impacted in order to deliver an effect closer to home. So the question is not just one of defense spending, just like it is for every other European country, but what it is actually to be spent on. And that's where the essential element for being ready is common to Switzerland as it is to every other European country. Despite the very distinct strategic situation here, there's one baseline that is common to everybody, and that's the necessity for an honest and objective assessment of the strategic situation and what the threats are, one that is not tainted either by Russian disinformation or by ideology, by political stances that are determined by ideology rather than objective assessment. And then leading on to something else that has not happened across many European countries, a national conversation about what that actually means, what the real risks are, what is at stake, what is the cost of reducing those risks versus what is the cost of ignoring the risks, and finally, of course, what it means for individuals. Because that's the realization that as part of this failure to communicate by governments has not sunk in across so much of Europe, that lives are going to have to change if the worst case scenarios for how Russia might act in the future are going to be averted.
I mean, let's say that the assessment of the Ministry of Defense is quite clear, I guess. I mean, they know that the army is not well equipped. We know it for a long time. We have 30 years of peace dividend as well. We don't have air defense, which is going to be much more important. We don't have long-range missiles to just deter. And actually, we ordered air defense, which was given to Germany from the US, because we are not helping Ukraine. So this is our situation. We seem quite alone at the moment. And there are still many people who think that neutrality is just protecting us. I mean, you have another candidate, another neutral candidate in the European Union with Ireland. Also neutral, also thought up to now being protected by geography, distance, and neutrality. Is there any insights from Ireland that you could give our people to say that why neutrality would not really help?
Well, Ireland is in a very different geography and as a result in a very different political situation. It is a state that is not surrounded by buffers against Russia. It is a state that is responsible for a vast area of maritime space containing things that are important to Europe as a whole, data and subsea communications cables with which Russia is extremely interested. It makes itself a target simply by virtue of the fact that it has declined to defend any of this and outsourced its defense to an already overstretched British armed forces. So by failing to protect any of this critical infrastructure, it invites intervention by Russia. So that, in that respect, it's a very different situation.
I don't know whether it's so different, because if you look at Switzerland, if you look at the transportation that goes through, energy that goes through Switzerland, data streams, especially the financial ones, are going through Switzerland. I don't know whether the situation is so different. Well,
Switzerland's defences may, if you listen to the defence forces, be insufficient, but that is a far cry from saying that it is defenceless, which is the Irish situation, more or less. However, what the situation, the point in common, is the belief that if you are not involved in the conflict because you are neutral, then the conflict will not come to you. And this is fundamentally misguided, unfortunately, because you may not be interested in Russia, but Russia is definitely interested in you. And sadly, a piece of paper that Ireland might wave saying we are neutral is not going to be any defense against a missile coming in.
One last question, and then I open to you. I mean, we talked a lot about defense and deterrence and weapons and ammunition, etc., but influence is a very important thing also in Switzerland. And at one point you say that that there could be much more readiness, and that, for example, Ukraine did a lot. We still have, or lots of people in the West, to my understanding, still think that, okay, there is propaganda from the two sides, so whom should we really believe? But the other thing is also, what could one do to really undermine this influence in a more concrete way? Because I think we know it, the government knows it as well, but what to do?
Yes, it's another problem that, because it has been ignored for so long, is far, far worse than it would necessarily have been. The influence permeating not just from the deliberate carriers of Russian narratives, but also the people who have been exposed to them for so long that they are infected by it. the useful idiots, the agents of influence, and the people who are so soaked in Russian disinformation because there have been no countermeasures, that they form part of the internal problem for pushing through the kind of change and reform that is essential for defense. Day before yesterday, I had a long interview for L'Express, the French periodical, where the journalist told me that the story was about the recent comments by the French military chief saying that we should expect a test from Russia in 2 to 3 years. And the editorial position, as expressed by the editor who commissioned this interview, was that this is not true. They're just saying it because the armed forces want more money.
So the media, let's say, fell in the back of the military who said there is a necessity to build up. Because they are so imbued with the stories that have come across about Russia not being a threat, that they will suspend disbelief and instead say that it is the military that is making it up. So where do you start? In the UK, there's been a significant change in how this problem is addressed by finally making working on behalf of a hostile power to subvert the UK illegal, which for a long time it wasn't. The activities of the agents of influence that were trying to carry out subversion were so prolific because there was absolutely nothing to stop them. Back in 2020, the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament discovered, to its surprise and shock and to some extent horror, that there were enormous legislative gaps in the country's defences. Not just perfectly legal to be a subversive agent of a hostile power, but also perfectly legal to carry out espionage on behalf of a hostile power, unless and until you succeed, because only then it becomes a crime. So since then, the UK has put on the statute book several new legislative acts, including, finally, last year, a National Security Act came into force. How important that is has been demonstrated by how busily that has been applied ever since. It is causing changes in behavior from people who we know were long-standing assets of Russia, injecting Russian narratives and disinformation, not just in media space, but also behind closed doors, in government, in universities, in businesses, etc. They have gone quiet, or they've gone abroad. But also, more importantly, it's a universal instrument because it's not Russia-focused. It's something that tackles all of the different security challenges that don't necessarily just come from Moscow, from China, from Iran. All of these things are covered by a new element of legislation. But the UK isn't the only country that had that gap, where there'd been a permissive environment for people to work against the national interests of the country that they are in, because of a commitment to freedom of expression, which went above and beyond legitimate, innocent speech and actually protected things which were deeply harmful to political processes. Yes, thank you very much. I mean, this is something Switzerland is struggling as well. We know that we have espionage much more than other countries in Europe, and that intelligence should need some new legislation as well. And thank you for giving us the example. Now, I would like to have you with some questions. We did not talk about China. We did not talk about Trump in excessive. We all know that. I just wanted to have everything from you I could have in these 50 minutes from Russia. So feel free to broaden the horizon for your questions. Okay. First row, second row, and then first row.
Yeah, thank you. Why is it that we don't see more...
Would you just briefly introduce yourself?
My name is Walter Turner. I'm former Chancellor of Switzerland. And I wonder, why is it that we don't see more terrorist attacks of Ukrainians in Moscow? Is it because they are not able to do it, or because they don't want to do it? I mean, most of them are perfectly speaking Russian. Why is it, talking about Ireland, that nobody's bringing the war to Moscow, like in the Chechen war? Why is it that we don't see that now in this war?
Why do we not see terrorist attacks by Ukrainians? I think the very simple answer is that the Ukrainian sides are not the terrorists. So yes, you do see targeted attacks against senior Russian commanders carried out across the whole of Russia, including in Moscow. What you don't see are the indiscriminate attacks on the most vulnerable in society, which is a Russian speciality. The Ukrainian side follows very clearly. The Western dictates for how you use military force that you avoid civilian casualties and collateral damage, as opposed to using them as a tool of war, as Russia does. So it's a very clear example of how we have two very different cultures opposing each other, one that is European and one that is most definitely not.
In the first row. Thank you. Please.
Jacques de Rocleroy, Swiss Re. It's a variation on the same theme, but not alluding to terrorism, but the best defense is the offense to a certain extent, and trying to weakening your opponent. I remember, there was Radio Europe, there were free, at the time of radio, there were some specific radios trying to create disinformation or real information in Russia. Why is there, or does that exist today? Is there some attempt to weaken by influencing, and does that exist today?
Not to the extent that you're thinking about. And this is one of the conversations that has come up constantly since 2014, when, in particular, Western politicians realized the power of Russia's information weapons and disinformation, and started to think, well, we must do something in return because we must get the truth through to ordinary Russians. Unfortunately, they were a decade and a half too late, because one of the long-term programs of overhaul of defenses that Vladimir Putin put in place when he arrived in power was overhauling information defenses and making sure that none of the vulnerabilities that they identified in Russian society could actually be used in the same way that Russia was using the same vulnerabilities toward the West. So they closed off, for example, foreign media ownership. They closed off the means by which foreign broadcasters were delivering messages within major Russian cities. Shortwave radios of the kind that you're thinking about from the Cold War had disappeared a long time ago. That broadcasting had gone. Instead, it was rebroadcasting arrangements within Russian cities on the assumption that Russia would remain a friendly power. So it was very easy to just shut them down. So yes, there are attempts to get messages through to Russians. The problem, though, is that a lot of the messages are not actually going to have a significant impact. If you are trying to convince people that Russia's actions and the actions of its armed forces in Ukraine are criminal, you're not going to get very far with a population that, by and large, is urging its armed forces on to commit more and better genocide. Actually making some kind of change, bottom-up change within Russia is probably impossible at that point. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried, but it is not what is going to make the difference.
Thomas Jordan, former Swiss Central Bank.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. Given the situation that we are in at the moment, and you described it as a very difficult one, what is now the best strategy for the West to end this war as soon as possible? And what would a reasonable peace look like under those circumstances?
The strategy by the West to end the war as soon as possible is exactly the same as it always has been. Maximum support for Ukraine so that it can beat back Russia, beat off Russia, and cause sufficient damage to Russia that it understands that it was a mistake to launch the war in the first place. That hasn't happened, and it probably won't happen, which means that the second part of your question, unfortunately, is a question for a previous time. There will not be a just peace. There will not be a peace which recognizes the immense damage that Russia has done. The broken lives, the dead children, the destruction of Ukrainian cities, the savage military occupation, all of that cannot be undone, no matter how many reparations might be theoretically envisaged from Moscow. It's past time for a just peace. It's not necessarily past time for a peace which preserves Ukraine, but it requires vastly more commitment from the United States and from Europe to ensuring that Russia can be defeated and beaten back so that Ukraine can be preserved, and therefore so that the front line for the whole of Europe can hold fast.
And one thing, I'm just coming in because I have a similar question here, or let's say the other way around. I mean, you say that Russia clearly will stay a threat, even if there is some solution for Ukraine. Russia will not stop threatening Europe. And one guest online is asking, how would a Russian-dominated Europe look like? I mean, if this cannot happen, what we were asking.
Well, we have seen this before in living memory. We know what it means. We know the programs of deportation, which is a fancy word for enslavement, that took place across the Baltic states, across Poland, as soon as Russia gained control over these territories. We know what it means for your economy to be set back by decades, for your society to be degraded by the dead hand of Moscow on it. We know exactly what it leads to when Russia wages these colonial wars and subjugates the populations that it takes over to this brutal regime. This is the reason why the frontline states, where this memory is freshest, are the most determined that it should never happen again. This comes through in some very brutal statistics. For example, the comparison has been made between the ways in which Finland and Latvia navigated the Second World War. Finland fought off the Soviet Union at a cost of 3% of its population, and of course, loss of territory, vast damage to its economy, an impact which lasted for decades of the reparations they had to pay to the Soviet Union under Allied guidance, under Allied direction. Latvia chose a different course and could not resist, felt that it was unable to fight against the Soviet Union when it had no friends. Latvia didn't lose 3% of its population, it lost 12% as a minimum, not counting the ones that emigrated. So they make this stark comparison between what it costs to resist and what it costs to surrender, and a lot of people around the frontline states have reached the conclusion that resistance is the only option.
Yeah. We really ran out of time, so one last question, please.
Thank you. Jörg Reinhardt, Swiss Report. I mean, given all what you told us tonight, which was not vitally encouraging, at least not in my view, I have to say, and your knowledge about the situation and the players in the different games that we have at the moment, with Putin continuing to push the Europeans don't get their act together, I mean, what is the situation going to look like? What's the most likely scenario for 10 years from now? In your view, where will we be in 10 years from now?
10 years is quite ambitious, given that 10 days is challenging enough in itself. I find it hard to envisage what will happen beyond the 3 to 4 years that we are commonly hearing is the duration of the war as it continues at the moment. A lot of this is down to the length of time that Russia can continue waging war at the current intensity before it has to change tack. We heard predictions from knowledgeable people that Russia would start to run out of money and of military equipment and of manpower by the end of this year. Russia's been rescued from that to some extent by North Korea, by support from China. But eventually there will come a point at which Russia is no longer able to continue. And the real question is whether that is beyond the point at which Ukraine either gathers sufficient support from outside, including financial support, not just military, to ensure that its economy can survive, or develops its own defense industry to the point where it can deliver a blow against Russia that causes Russia to reconsider, or Russia does in fact succeed in grinding down Ukrainian resistance. Those are probably development paths that we're going to see over 3 to 4 years. Now, the problem with looking out to 10 years is as soon as you have the end of major combat operations in Ukraine, through whichever route that is reached, the clock starts ticking. Because that is the point at which Russia is looking to the next stage in its campaign to achieve what President Putin has set out as his goal. Now, what that means is there's a choice there, and it's a choice that Europe has to make now. Because if Russia is beaten back, if Russia is defeated, the scale of that defeat will determine the size and the length of the breathing space that Europe has before Russia has another go. The bigger the setback to Moscow, the more the damage done to the armed forces, the more time Europe has to get itself ready for when Russia feels that it is in a position to make its next attempt. All of this is yet another reason to add to all of the moral and practical reasons that we see day to day for Europe to give the maximum possible support to Ukraine in order to deliver that defeat to Russia and buy Europe more time.
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop here. We could listen to you for hours. Thank you very much for your insights into this special, very threatening country and people. And thank you for giving us this call to action. Thank you very much, Keir Giles.
Thank you, Katja. Thank you.